Howdy, folks, and welcome back to another episode of Meta-Ideological Politics. Let's face it, we're all blind in some ways. Accusations swirl around being colorblind, developmentally blind, ideologically blind, conspiratorially blind, the list goes on and on. Blindness can be framed in the negative, like not seeing something, or it can be described in the positive, like being actively blinded by our ignorance, delusion, and desires for how we want things to be. But underpinning every form of blindness may be the most profound and deeply disturbing of them all, what energy and sustainability aficionado Nate Hagens calls reality blindness. For many reasons, us humans are all too often blind to the constraints of physical reality itself, to the mineral, material, and energetic substrata of which our civilization depends. Reality blindness transcends partisan finger pointing, with bad notions of planetary sustainability promulgated by left, right, and center, from unrealizable ecological utopias to naive techno-optimism to drill, baby, drill. Here to help us illuminate our blindness is my good friend, Chris Perez. Chris recently published a viral Medium article called, "If You Don't Know These 10 Facts, You're Energy Blind," which neatly encapsulates Hagens' core insights. We'll cover salient points from his article and explore all the ways we can go wrong in our conceptions of energy, technology, and long-term civilizational viability. We'll address common repudiations of Hagens' thesis, address the limitations of various energy sources, and get to the root of our ecological predicament. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great. All right, so you've been recently very inspired and captivated by the work of Nate Hagens. So just give a little intro into what you found so interesting about Hagens' work, maybe a little bit about Hagens himself and how you would describe his whole shtick when it comes to energy and reality blindness of these subjects, and kind of, take it away.
Sure. Well, Nate has a PhD in like ecological economics, and a lot of his work kind of slammed right face first into the last scraps of my techno-utopianism. And I was like a techno-utopian back in 2014. I was reading Max Tegmark Life 3.0. I was reading The Singularity is Near, and I really thought that we were on the precipice of mass technological unemployment and, interstellar travel. And I thought everything was just a little bit away. And I thought, for instance, that every car on Earth would be electric by now, because all of the trend lines were looking in that direction. And then I found myself in a very strange situation when none of those things started to happen on those kinds of timelines. And Nate's theory is mainly about why we can be so far off of the mark in terms of our understanding of what the future looks like and why it can or cannot look like that. And his focus is on energy and materials blindness. And basically, his point is that we're unaware of just how limited energy is, how much of it is based in fossil fuels, and how limited our mineral resources are on this planet, and how hard it is to actually increase mining capacity to get the products and services of the future that we all think are right around the horizon.
Yeah, great intro. So I think for a lot of this recording, we're going to be laying into the kind of techno-utopian position. So before we do that, maybe we should just take a moment to define what that means. Like, what did it mean for Chris Perez 8 years ago to be a techno-optimist?
It's basically the idea that technology and economics solutions can solve all of our problems. It's basically, so you could think of the global system as having four key components. One is energy, one is materials, one is technology, and one is economics. So the techno-utopian forgets about energy and materials and assumes that they are limitless, abundant, and not the source of the problem. They look at technology and economics as the solution space, the UBI, and just furthering tech in a humane way. Let's not let it, let's give it some guardrails, but within these parameters, our perfect future is like well within sight. So, and if you assume that either energy and materials is constant or stays the same over time, then you can say things like, oh, well, technological improvement will always have a deflationary impact on products everything you'll ever buy will end up becoming cheaper and cheaper because we keep improving the technology. But all of those things are based on essentially a faulty assumption that, for instance, that the grade of ores and different minerals isn't going down. The fact that the cost of basic energy is going up, and those are really steady over time. And when they're factored in, the rosy future gets a little bit harder to put numbers to. And you'll hear the techno-optimists say quick dismissive things like, oh, well, you know what, I think that despite this challenge of fossil fuel going away, we will definitely innovate a way out of it. With more investment will come the solution. And we've just not seen anything have a scalable or cheap alternative to fossil fuel in terms of what it can do and what it powers. So we're in a bit of a bind there.
Yeah, I think the fundamental premise of the techno-utopian position is that we can basically engineer our way and innovate our way out of some of the sustainability predicaments that we find ourselves in, right? And the kind of conclusion that people draw from a techno-optimist position is that we can more or less continue our current trajectory. We can make some adaptations and innovations in certain areas, right, economically and technologically, but fundamentally we can continue this kind of unsustainable trajectory, and we'll innovate our way out of it, and everything will be fine in the end. And human civilization will keep on progressing and advancing at the scale and rate of energy consumption that we currently are using. And I think what Hagens really illuminates is like, well, that's totally not true. That's where this critique of blindness comes in, right? Minerals, energy, and materials blindness, and the fact that people forget about the inputs that are necessary in order to extract energy, in order to run and to create these technological apparatuses that allow for energy extraction, right? And that there is a limitation, there's fundamental constraints on the inputs that are needed to power our civilization. And so then when we become blind to these things, we're just gonna run ourselves off a cliff and completely outstrip the carrying capacity, ecologically and materially of the earth.
Well, one place that's interesting to start, and this is where I started my essay, is that we feel that we're sort of replacing fossil fuels and coal, oil, natural gas with renewable alternatives. And what's really happening is we're actually just adding them on, and we've not reduced our use of fossil fuels at all. So we feel like this is extremely viable, right? We look at Europe and we say, hey, look, they're 20%, the EU uses 20% renewables for its energy needs. And it feels like we're making this really smooth transition. We're on our way, but really we've not reduced our use of fossil fuels at all. So we've gotten to feel the visual benefits, like you'll see Teslas on the road, but when you look at the math, we use more coal, oil, and natural gas today than we did 10 years ago, and the same all the way down. So it's a bit of a misnomer to think that we are replacing. We're currently just adding on top. So we have more and more energy, but eventually, as oil, coal, and natural gas continue to deplete, we're going to see prices continue to increase, and we're going to find that renewables, we don't have enough minerals in the ground or cheap energy to fully replace the energy drawdown that's going to come from this transition. So I would say that's one interesting first point there.
Right. And when I first read that in your article, what came to me, the phrase that entered my head is, this is transcend and include in the worst possible sense, right? We're developing new energy sources, but we're still using the old ones, the ones that we should be moving away from more and more and more, right? We're not switching over and reducing our consumption of coal, oil, and natural gas by switching to alternatives and renewables and so forth. We're just using more of the old stuff, the unsustainable stuff. And tacking on the sexy alternative stuff as kind of the cream on top.
And we're going to have to continue to use even more of them, of the fossil fuels, if we're going to try to increase the speed at which we try to transition. So the graphs might look even worse for a time, because we're going to need to do more mining, because let's say, okay, so 0.5% of the global car fleet is electric. right? So you can't recycle something that doesn't exist. So to build that out from 0.5% to all cars in the world being electric, you're going to need to vastly increase the mining of battery materials like lithium, etc., steel, aluminum. You're going to have to make a lot of plastics too, and artificial rubber for the tires and all of these things. So there's every time someone says we need to build more renewable technology, that's a demand on increased fossil fuel use to supply the energy, to mine the minerals, to transport them, to put them into factories which run on, things like natural gas, to construct them. And then and only then will they be assembled and put somewhere where they can start to draw some actual new energy.
Yeah, this is Hagens' brilliant formula that really blew my mind in the book, where he talks about, what was it, energy invested to energy return ratio.
Yes, EROI.
Right.
So that gets really brutal when you look at different sources of energy and different returns that we can get on them. So after World War II, thereabouts, we had an energy return with oil of 100 to 1, meaning if we spent 1 barrel to extract energy, we could get 100 barrels out. Now that traditional oil is more like 20 to 1, so it's 5 times more expensive, and something like 70 or 80% of US oil comes from shale, which is a 5 to 1. So most of the way the US produces oil now and gets it out of the ground is about 20 times the cost that it was in the 40s. Right. So you can look at cost of living and make a fair guess that it would be much more expensive to live now just off the cost of our main input.
Now, why is that? Is that because we've already picked all of the low-hanging energy fruits out there? So the oil and energy that is remaining in the ground is that much harder to get to, thus requires greater energy invested before we get a return?
Yes. So I did an article a while ago about how Los Angeles was actually the biggest urban oil field in the world at the time. And this was in like the 1920s to the 50s thereabouts. And at that time, you could stick a straw in Venice Beach, essentially, and oil would gush out. And that would happen in Manhattan Beach and in Long Beach. And there were tons of derricks everywhere. So that's the 100 to 1 energy return kind of stuff that people would think about. Those are huge pools of light crude that are extremely useful. They don't need heavy refinement. It was just an amazing energy resource. And now as we moved into less rich traditional wells that don't have as much oil, you're not going to get as much of a return for as long because it's just not as much supply. And then if we were going into shale, well, now you have to drill vertically and then horizontally and throw sand, water, and a chemical mixture to fracture a rock. And then some oil will gush out of there. But we can only get 10% of the oil out of every fracking well right now profitably. So we actually leave all of those fracking wells open. So in 3 years, it's 80% drained of what we can take out, and we just keep moving on. So that's the 5 to 1 return stuff. And if you look at renewables, full scale, apparently a wind turbine actually doesn't produce as much energy in its lifetime as it takes to actually make the turbine.
Wow. So we're not netting any energy from wind turbines?
I don't believe so, and it might depend, and I think that might improve as conditions change. But especially with global supply chains, 98% of wind turbines are made in China, so they're mining maybe in Africa, maybe in South America, somewhere like that. They're transporting all of that ore. They have to refine and distill all of those minerals into pure neodymium and other metals. Then they have to make it. Then they've got to ship it back to Europe, and then they put it offshore. It has a copper cable as thick as your leg, and that goes all the way from wherever it is offshore to land, where it can plug into an area where it can draw and store that power. So it's a huge engineering effort. So it's very hard to generate a net return on these more complex new sources of energy. It's just not as easy as, we used to just extract it, and now we have to make it. Well, that's a lot more work.
Right. What percentage of the total energy invested into something like a wind turbine is from the transportation costs, or is it only a small, like, are most of the costs energetically in terms of extracting the minerals and materials to make the thing and then making the thing? Like if they were made locally, would that cut down significantly or not really?
It would cut down some, but I don't think it would cut out the majority.
Okay. So we still wouldn't be
I
netting much.
I don't think we would net quite as much, but the point is, as fossil fuels decline, we're going to need some way to produce energy. So although maybe it costs more in fossil fuel energy than we'll get paid back in electricity, maybe that's a fine trade if the thing lasts long enough where we'll need some source of energy. And we can recondition the magnet inside if there's like a 4,000 pound magnet in every turbine. So maybe we can recondition those more effectively and recycle them better. But it is a challenge to try to replace basically a giant one-use liquid battery under the earth with a bunch of personally constructed batteries and human constructed sources to draw energy. It's just a much harder and more complex way to do it, and it doesn't net us as much. For instance, a lot of people talk about zero carbon fuels, like, oh, once we run out of oil for gasoline, we can use zero carbon fuels to pump that into our cars using electrolysis, hydrogen, CO2. The only thing that would come out of the tailpipe is carbon dioxide. Well, it sounds pretty good, but we actually put twice as much energy into that fuel as the fuel will give the car.
Right.
So that's an energy return of 0.5. The same, you get the same kind of problem with algae-based oil. So we can make oil real time using algae, but that has an energy return of 0.32 or so. So we can have a petrochemical industry and fuel certain vehicles with oil that we make from plants, but not at the scale that we're talking about now. That's the problem with all of the solutions that I'm looking at so far. There are options, but there is not the kind of scale we wish we could have, and the cost.
Right. Yeah, I want to run down the list of various energy sources, and we'll analyze them using the EROI ratio.
Sure.
But first, I mean, to try to, I guess, steelman the kind of techno-optimist position, right? I guess the techno-optimist would say, yeah, that's currently, given our level of current technological capability and engineering capacity. But with these improvements, and the field is constantly improving, right? Solar has improved by X amount over the last 10 years, whatever. Eventually, we'll have technological breakthroughs that will allow for a much better EROI ratio. Well, what is your response to that?
We've not seen it yet. So it's possible, and I would hope so. But I think what really has dwindled for me is the certainty that that's the case.
I see.
So like, for instance, fusion is not a net positive yet. It could be. Geothermal is net positive, like you've shared with me, in some places.
Right.
But we're not thinking global scale replacement for fossil fuels. Solar is very useful in some places. There is battery technology that is not based in lithium. It can be based in liquid. People are making giant mounds of dirt and literally spending energy to lift them off the ground, and the kinetic energy that they would expend by going back down acts as a battery. So there's lots of interesting ways that we can store energy, none of which are as efficient as simply pulling the resource out of the ground. So I think there's one of the quotes from the book is that renewables can power a great civilization, just not this one. And I think by that, Nate means that we can get enough energy by utilizing a smattering of nuclear, solar, wind, and different storage methods, and dealing with intermittency when it's not essential, like for a non-grid related purpose or something like that. But when we try to combine all of these sources and these alternate fuels and everything, we're not yet seeing a situation that can give us 19 terawatts of continuous power on the planet. Nowhere near at the right cost. That's the problem too. These are all very expensive. It's all more expensive than oil. So that translates to, scarcity.
Right. So the oil EROI is currently 20-1.
Of conventional oil where that exists. Yeah. So if maybe Saudi Arabia is still at 20-1. But so for instance, like I said, like 70 or 80% of the United States energy production is shale oil, which is all 5-1. The Canadian tar sands is either 4-1 or 5-1 because they have to do a lot of stuff to it. But that's still, again, there's an ease to that comparatively because you can still just pull something out, and that is an energy source that can be pumped into ships. It can be a precursor. It's a precursor ingredient to our entire petrochemicals industry, and like about 25% of a barrel of oil is basically used to make chemicals, plastics, rubber, soap, lotion, drugs, all kinds of things. I mean, it's in like 90% of products. They have some component that came from oil. The camera on the iPhone is made of plastic, which is all from oil, right? So it's an incredible resource because you can do everything with it, and nothing replaces that dynamic nature of oil.
Right. Do we know the long-term trajectory for that? Like in 10 years, it'll be 10-1 or like.
Oh, of the EROI decline?
For oil.
Yeah, I've actually done some math on that. It's actually with 3% growth, if you take all of our current oil reserves, we have like 1.6 trillion barrels of conventional oil left on the planet. We have about 6 trillion barrels, which is almost 6 times, of shale left. But like we said, we can only take 10% out right now. That's partially a technological problem, and also I would guess a cost option, right? Because if we don't have the technology to get that other 90% of shale out of a well, it's probably going to be very, very expensive, and the energy return then is going to get a little bit wacky at that point. Right. So with all of that, with 3% growth, we have something like 35 years left.
Wow, that's terrifying. So
yeah, and that's not talking about what the cost will start to do as you get near that, right? So that's what it seems like.
Right. As we were talking about, right? Like maybe in the future, in the not so distant future, driving a car would be only something that the Elon Musks and Jeff Bezoses of the world do. Kind of like owning a yacht or a private jet is only if you're a billionaire currently, right? Just because the cost of using oil is going to be so expensive given the scarcity inflation.
Exactly. It will be incredibly expensive. So I don't feel that bad that, oil is only 100 or something a barrel, because in the Great Recession, it was 140 adjusted for inflation. So we've seen higher prices.
Oh, wow. So
it was 140 then. And part of the interesting thing about what happened at that time, of course, we were very over leveraged. People who made less than we do, we had 4 or 5 mortgages because there were no checks, right? So I don't mean to say that the system was healthy, but at that time, it was like 2005, and Saudi Arabia more than doubled the amount of wells and drilling rigs to their oil operation, and they increased production by only like 6%.
Wow. Okay.
And this was pre-shale, right? So this was before the United States was responsible for most of the global uptick in oil production since like 2012 or something. So there was a point where we tried to produce more oil and we couldn't. So what happened in Saudi Arabia in 2005 is supposedly a contributing factor to the Great Recession, because we were unable to meet demand. And that scarcity of oil is going to, it's a core part of the entire economy. So that was a good part of it too.
So, I mean, to get political for a second, I mean, so a lot of Republicans are now calling for drill, baby, drill. The logic being that we're seeing obviously a lot of oil or gas prices being very inflated. And so if we increase the supply of oil by going ham on drilling, then that'll bring prices down for consumers.
Yes, we have to. We have to keep drilling because 80% of US oil production is shale, which means in 3 years, that would be reduced by 80% if we stopped drilling. So it's a Red Queen phenomenon. We have to keep drilling as fast as possible to stay in place. So after 1 year, we would have 40% less oil production if we stopped drilling right now. That's the problem with shale, among many. It's more expensive and everything, but it requires constant drilling because you extract that first 10% of those shale wells so quickly, we can do nothing with the rest. So we have to keep moving on. And it takes constant drilling. So that means new permitting and a lot of new concessions because we're going to have to do it in places people might not like. You have to use a lot of water to frack. People don't like that either.
Right, not to mention negative ecological externalities that are produced in the process and the risks.
Absolutely.
Right.
Groundwater, earthquakes, you name it. Yeah, it's not pretty.
Yeah, apparently geothermal also has earthquake problems affiliated with it because you have to do a lot of drilling and digging, and you don't know how you're disrupting the subcutaneous layers of the earth.
I'm sure of it. I mean, I'm still very much an amateur in this entire topic. I've just become very interested because, of course, Nate does such a good job covering all of this stuff. So one other part I wanted to mention, which is sort of anti-tech utopianism, is deeper than just the energy problem, and it has to do with minerals. So just like you have an energy return on investment with oil, you have ore grade with minerals. So this is a really important idea. So let's say roughly 200 years ago around the United States, in riverbeds, you would find 300-pound pure copper rocks. It was just unbelievable. You didn't even have to mine for some minerals a long time ago. You could just find them in high ore grade percentages. Now, currently with copper, we need to mine 200 tons of minerals to get 1 ton of copper. So the ore grade ratio is 200 to 1, and that's not getting better. So, and we, just like we did with oil, we took the simplest, quickest, highest grade stuff first, and now we have to do more mining in more places and spend more energy to get the same exact amount. So the mining industry as a whole is currently having a problem increasing its production on average right now. And that's across the board. There are some minerals that are more in decline than others, but broadly speaking, it is a challenge already. And for instance, half of new Teslas are produced without cobalt or nickel because we've already had shortages of that. So the new batteries are LNG batteries, I believe, and they don't have any nickel or cobalt in them. So they don't have as good a range, but they are what we can make.
Totally. Kind of a orthogonal point here, but it really makes me think about the limits of localism and local production, given that I think when we're minerals and materials blind, there's a lot of countries in the world, like Japan is notorious for having an incredible lack of natural resources. So Japan is hyper dependent on imports, right? That's why Yamamoto decided to attack Pearl Harbor, which was a completely stupid idea from a rational military perspective. But it's because after Japan invaded China and Manchuria and started their campaign across Southeast Asia, the US decided to put an embargo, and the US was importing 80% of Japan's oil to fund their imperialistic regime. So after that happened, we're like, fuck it, let's go bomb Pearl. I'm saying, yeah, let's go, like I'm a part of the Japanese. Like, we're saying, we're like, all right, let's go bomb Pearl Harbor, which is a completely stupid idea because they're not giving us the resources that we need. Right. So this whole idea of like, well, just localize, don't be so dependent on these fragile global supply chains. but it's like, but they don't have access to those resources and materials and minerals that you need to do what you want to do, right? As a country, as a society, as a civilization.
Not at all. I mean, no, very few. I mean, the iPhone takes 6 continents to make, and so does any other complex thing. And that's not changing. Um, and there's an incredible centralization of manufacturing, of course, in China, and their entire economic system is now requires to keep their growth rate going, because they picked all the low-hanging development fruit out of their own country. They built ghost cities before people even bought one unit of one building, and they poured more concrete in 2 years than the US did in an entire century. And then they ran out of opportunity in local construction. So through the BRI initiative, they went through lots of parts of Africa, the Middle East, and South America in agreements to personally fund, whether or not a country could afford to pay off a loan, a dam, a railroad, a factory. And their whole deal was, if you fail to pay this loan back, I will get a 99-year lease on a port, or I'll be granted possession of a certain mineral resource in a certain area. So this allowed China's 5 to 8% growth regime to continue, because they found new places they found all the low-hanging fruit on the planet, and now they're basically under the impression that, well, so money is fake, so let's convert it to resource control before any kind of collapse happens. And when the dominoes fall, we will have possession of the ports we want, the minerals we need. And any country, especially in Europe, that wants to make this transition to zero carbon is going from a huge dependence on Russia for gas to a huge dependence on China for all the windmills and all the solar panels. So it's just a really interesting space to watch. And
wow.
Yeah,
geopolitical ramifications. We'll have to see what happens. Let's look at a few other energy sources, continuing with the EROI analysis. Solar. What is the ratio?
Solar is, I believe, 20-1. It really depends on. So the difficulty with EROI is it depends on the boundaries. So you can get an EROI of 12 to 20-1 with solar, but if you look from like manufacture to finished product and actual energy production, it can be as low as 4 or 5. So the EROI is harder to determine with renewables, because you have to make something first. So with solar, maybe in Arizona, maybe solar is roughly 10-1, but in somewhere cloudy, it might be 3 or 4-1. So it really depends. So you also have the intermittency going on, but it's not terrible. And wind is up there too, between like the 10 and 20 range. But again, it depends on whether or not you have the wind.
But at the beginning, you were saying, I thought you said wind turbines like pretty bad.
Their full scale energy return isn't positive, but once you have one constructed, it's roughly 10-20 on return. So it depends on how you factor it in. If you talk about manufacture currently to production, most wind turbines seem to be negative in their overall return.
So if there are innovations, like you'll hear in the solar industry, that there are innovations in terms of how long the panels last, so that will contribute to a positive EROI.
Absolutely. So some panels now last about 40 years. So that's pretty good.
Yeah. Okay, got it. How about nuclear? What is your position on nuclear? Like, we have examples of like the France versus Germany. So France went all in on nuclear. Germany, after Fukushima, decided to really scale it back.
Yeah. Well, nuclear has an EROI of roughly 14-1, and it's pretty good as a grid tool because it's very steady. So like coal is also used for grid operations because it's hard to turn it on and off, just like nuclear. But whereas natural gas, you can kind of flip a switch and those generators turn right on.
Right.
Coal and nuclear are good steady state sources of power. Nuclear is obviously far cleaner and has less waste for the amount of energy that it gives, but it's incredibly complex to construct, and you have waste product issues. So if you're in an area of the world that's not very stable, you have to worry about, well, what happens if a militia gets control of the spent nuclear fuel? They're out in pools nearby, and they have to be cooled for a very long time with constant power, and they're often not very well guarded because that's another cost.
Mm, mm.
So nuclear, the issues I have with nuclear are global systemic risk and complexity to construct and maintain. That's a scaling issue. I think it's good in some places, like in the United States, built well, or in France. I don't have a huge issue, but a global nuclear powered civilization, that presupposes a level of global stability that I think is unrealistic.
I see. So in the US, I mean, someone recently they called it a nuclear Green New Deal. Like, is that something that you would support, or you would have a lot of hesitations about?
I don't think it's realistic to expect 100% of our electricity to come from nuclear, because we are so slow at constructing nuclear power plants. And there's, not only do they take a very long time to get permitted and allowed to be made in various areas, but the other problem is cost. There are cost overruns because the projects take up to 15 years per reactor. So during that time, costs can overrun by billions of dollars. So we're having a speed issue already. We only add net maybe one reactor globally a year, one or two.
Okay.
Because others get decommissioned. So it's a very, very complex source of energy, but it's very strong once it's created. There are options that are easier. They're like small modular reactors that run on thorium and things like that. And I think they will play a role in the stabler parts of the world, but they require incredible levels of technical skill. So we're going to see more nuclear in like the global north and in places that are highly, highly developed and hopefully stable for the long term. But you wouldn't expect that really in South America and the Middle East, largely speaking, because it's just very complex and dangerous in the wrong hands in an unstable environment.
That makes complete sense. What about the promise of nuclear fusion? Whenever that's supposed to happen?
Maybe if it becomes a net positive, there are some things like nuclear fusion and 0-point energy where if we figure it out, hey, we're all wrong about this. In terms of electricity generation, we would be totally fine. You could just figure out storage at that point, and we would be all very happy about that electricity solution. We would just need to figure out, using that energy to convert biofuels into like petrochemicals so that we could continue to make hospital grade plastics and various products that we cannot go without. I think that's a really cool developing space, but in terms of timing, I just don't see that over the horizon. It's going to be more long term. So as a replacement in the next decade, we could count that out pretty safely.
Okay, gotcha. How well do you understand the physics behind nuclear fusion versus nuclear fission?
Not very well at all.
Okay, neither do I. I don't understand any of these topics very well, but
yeah, I mean, nuclear fusion is you're essentially trying to make making the temporary conditions to have a star on Earth. Right. So you're just turning hydrogen into helium at a rate that nets you some energy, and then it shuts off. But it has the same kind of complexity and risk problems as nuclear fission, in that a reactor gone bad could be a huge problem.
Right.
That, in a way that solar and wind is just not that big of an issue, and it's not that complex.
Right. So I read something that we actually already have the technology for nuclear fusion. We haven't found a way to store, contain it. Like they said, the question is, how do you put the sun in a box? Like we don't know, it'll just melt the whatever you try to contain it in.
Well, we have the capacity to do fusion. It just takes more energy to get the process going than the energy we get out of it. We can start fusion reactions and get some energy out, but it
We just
takes
want to
us
net.
more energy to do that. Yeah,
Got it. Got it. Okay. So we're hoping for an efficiency breakthrough where we'll start to net energy.
that's it. That's
Got
it.
it. Okay. But we shouldn't bank on it. Is kind of the theme here.
Thinking in bets, I would not put my chips on short-term nuclear fusion or zero-point energy to scale to global solutions.
Right. 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 What is 0 point energy?
Zero-point energy is a physics concept that I think Nikola Tesla was working on, and it's not something I understand, but it's a way of netting energy from subatomic particles. So it's another highly complex way of creating energy that I don't understand and has not yet been successful. But it's one of those. Let's put it on the shelf, and perhaps later it could be a very useful form of energy.
It feels like it's something that's very steeped in like lore and mythology and I mean Tesla is kind of like a kind of mythological figure almost, and there's a lot of interesting conspiracies, some true, some not true, about his legacy and how he got screwed over by some of the robber barons, during the Gilded Era. But anyway, that's a thing for another time. Um, I want to get a little bit into the economics part of it too, because Hagens is very knowledgeable about economics. I think he even has a degree in finance, um, and he actually has some prescriptions in terms of taxation mechanisms and so forth that can kind of help with our sustainability predicament. So just generally opening it up here, what is Hagens' economic angle in all of this?
Well, his angle is, among other things, he doesn't really like the idea of income tax. He would
Mm-hmm.
prefer to do a value added tax, a very heavy one on, especially on items that are luxury oriented that nobody really needs.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to tax the income of people that make, less than $60,000 a year, it seems patently ridiculous, and that we should instead get a lot of our tax revenue by taxing corporations and by taxing luxury goods that people are only buying for signaling purposes.
I mean, I agree with, as someone who makes less than 60 grand a year, I completely agree with that. Especially as a contractor. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's interesting too. I mean, I think that different countries have different value added tax rates, right? So I think Yang proposed a 10% VAT in the US, and he would use that to fund UBI. I think the EU average is like 20. I think Hungary's is 29%.
Yeah, and some cars are taxed at 200% in South America and in
Oh,
the
wow.
Middle East. Sometimes to get a license plate with a cool number is $3 million.
Right. I think
So
one criticism of, or it could either be a criticism or it could be a plus of a VAT, is that it would act as a kind of de facto sales tax and then push costs onto consumers. Now, from a sustainability angle, you could say great, right?
it depends on the good that we do this with, right? If we
Right.
do it on goods that are $2,000 or more, where the average good in that category is $100, I don't think anyone would complain. Right?
So if we're doing it in that way, is Hagens mostly interested in getting tax revenue from it, or more as a kind of a deterrent?
Both. I think it would be more of a luxury item, and it would be better at deterring conspicuous consumption that is debt based, right? We should definitely bring up the fact that increasing energy efficiency creates more emissions. The Jevons paradox.
Oh yeah, yeah. Go ahead and talk about that.
Yeah, so when a resource in our economy becomes more efficient, it lowers the cost. And that means we consume more until the price goes back up to where it was before.
Yes, it increases the
So
demand.
yeah, it increases demand. So let's say this is an example from Nate's book, Reality Blind. Let's say we decrease the cost of air conditioners, right? We make a new one that's more energy efficient and cheaper to make. Well, now you've unlocked hundreds of millions of new customers in India and South America and China who can finally have air conditioning for the first time because it's hit a particular price point. So now the energy draw globally is so much higher, but you've increased efficiency. So it's extremely difficult to, like on a personal level, you can see how somebody could reduce their personal consumption. This is why the Jevons paradox is kind of difficult to think through, because people think about it very personally. Like, well, if my TV is LED and so is my computer, and I have a more efficient air conditioner, and my car is electric, I'm reducing my net consumption of energy.
Right.
But we don't think about the 8 new consumers that just on each technological innovation just unlocked. So it's not immediately expected, but it's an emergent property of like economics.
Exactly. Well, the market keeps on expanding for it, right? You just opened up a whole new market niche that now has economic access to that type of technology at that lower price point. And so more people on the whole in the aggregate are now using that thing. So even if you as an individual decrease your individual amount of net energy consumption, the planet as a whole might have increased them or at least counterbalance it in a kind of negative feedback process.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, it is very paradoxical. I think of this too, and maybe this relates to Jevons paradox, but it's also like the thesis of technological deflation, because at the same time, right, like we can make an innovation and therefore the prices of certain technological goods and products are going to go down, right? Like how expensive were computers back in the 70s versus an iPhone that you can have now for 999 whatever. But then this is a thing that I've been thinking about since I've been turned on by this concept of materials and minerals blindness. We're going to start running out. The energy input and the costs of production and the limitation and scarcity of available minerals and materials will make the scarcity go up, which means that prices will also go up because the supply will go down. And so it's like, well, on one hand, we're innovating and bringing costs down, but then we're also because there's a finite amount of minerals and materials and energy, that's going to create scarcity, so the price is going to go up. So it's constantly kind of like negative feedbacking, right?
And it's worse than that too, because we picked all the low-hanging fruit of technological innovation that people want, that really impacts their lives. Like back when the iPhone was new, each innovation set was so enormous that most people who were able to got the new iPhone, for instance. Now, we know a lot of people that have an 8, 7, 9, 10, whatever, and they don't really need the 13, the 14. And I would have an older iPhone if I didn't have more of a storage need, but you can't expand the storage. So there goes my demand. But broadly speaking, we've plucked all the low-hanging innovation fruit that makes a device cheaper, and we know now that almost every iPhone you could possibly buy does everything you could need, and they're getting very, very expensive because all of the incremental improvements are stuff that most people don't really need.
Right. It starts scaling off. I mean, it really started scaling off since the concept of the smartphone was invented, right? I mean, that alone was such a revolutionary breakthrough. And it's like, oh, now you can have 3 cameras instead of 1, which gives a better video quality. Right. But like this is like a 6, I think.
Yeah. Like the iPhone 10 to 20 will not have as much meaningful innovation as iPhones 1 through 10 for the average person.
I mean, all of this is kind of bringing us to the ultimate billion-dollar question, right? Which is like, so what's a solution?
Well, the easiest solution that no one wants to talk about is using less energy.
Right.
Because that would cause to be fair, I would call it a hiccup in our economic system, because that would be the first time we had sustained, shrinkage of the economy. If we use, let's say 30 or 40 or 50% less energy, that would de facto cause a economic recession or a depression.
Right.
And I recently listened to a podcast with Nate and Joseph Tainer, and
Oh, nice.
Tainer was talking about steady state economies.
Hmm.
And they were kind of going back and forth on whether or not that was even feasible. And I think for biological reasons, stasis is basically impossible, and that we can either grow slightly or a lot, or shrink slightly or a lot. But stasis is kind of like a theoretical concept. And, we have people aging out of workforces,
Right.
going into them, boom, bust. Supplies either are going up or down. Everything's too dynamic to, I think, average out some steady state solution.
Right. I mean, how is that measured though? Is that measured in terms of annual
GDP.
GDP? So what
Yeah.
about Japan? Japan as an example, like they've kind of been at stasis since the 90s after their housing market collapsed. I think in '94, the bubble burst.
Yeah, they've been in a relative stasis, but I don't think that that's much of an achievable goal of most economies, because most people are so riddled with debt, and debt requires growth. Debt implies a need for growth to pay it off.
Yeah.
So if you look at like American consumer debt versus like the average European, like a European citizen could see a more steady state life for themselves, because they can be a millerismo and just make €1,000 a month and basically use a debit card and not have debt at all, consumer debt, not for education, medical, or personal consumption reasons. So, but the United States would have a very hard time with steady state, because people here have students have an average of whatever $30,000 or $40,000 of student debt. We have large mortgages. We have huge amounts of consumer debt, credit card debt. It's incredible. So a steady state is pretty unrealistic for a place like the United States that's so much more over leveraged. And I don't know about consumer debt in Japan. I'm running into walls of knowledge here.
Yeah, yeah. I think Japan's debt to GDP ratio is a little confusing because on a whole they have a very high their national debt is like really really bad, but they have a very high private savings rate amongst citizens. So the government is heavily in debt, but the average American consumer has far more personal debt than the average Japanese citizen. So theoretically, it would be easier for them to pay it off should the government tax the shit out of its citizenry to fund their debt. So that's why foreign
Right.
investors haven't lost confidence and haven't bailed on Japan, because they know that the money is there in the hands of Japanese citizens.
Right, that's a good point. And the US government is over leveraged, and so are all of its citizens on
Right.
average. So it's much less stable. There's no other place, and the natural resources are roughly in a managed decline. So there's no place in the US where you could find, the $110 trillion of resources to level everything out again. We did that already.
Right, right, right. So I mean, part of this gets to the lending economy, usury, right, and interest as being kind of the root of all evil, right? Like that's Charles Eisenstein wrote about that in his book Sacred Economics, and he has this really interesting thought experiment with these chicken farmers, where whenever, as you said, whenever like an entrepreneur takes on a loan, you have to pay back the debt and an interest. So that means you have to expand into a new market niche, right?
Yes.
Which means that the economy is ever expanding. It's what capitalism does. And eventually you're just going to run out of space, you're going to run out of stuff, or you have a economic collapse when everyone defaults on their loans.
Right. And I mean, it fundamentally depends, right, on what historical era you're in, right? Because you take somebody in, let's say, the early 1900s in the United States, there are lots of undeveloped places. There's a ton of oil almost everywhere. So if you created new money through issuing loans to people, they could walk into an undeveloped place and drill for oil and start farming and extract mineral resources, and they could make good on all of those loans and then some, and they could become, in today's money, multi-billionaires. But
Right.
in a situation like now, where minerals and oil and all of the low-hanging fruit is in decline, you can't, if you print more money and issue out more loans and debt, we don't have as much of a guarantee that that will be converted into natural capital and facilitate real growth. So we're seeing growth in things like, cryptocurrencies and NFTs, and the BlackRock going in and buying hundreds of thousands
Right.
of houses. So we're seeing all these massive distortions because we have no easy natural resources left to tap. There's no low-hanging new fruit in the United States.
Exactly. Yeah, that's really interesting. And we'll probably see a lot more of these kind of abstracted values, right, that people are going to be playing around with, investing in.
And it will be very bubbly, most likely,
Yes,
because
exactly.
it's, by definition, right, if the natural resources are in decline, the all new sources of value are going to be ever more detached from reality, and
Exactly.
thus more likely to be in prey to boom and bust cycles
And that's what we
endlessly.
saw in 2008, right? I mean, with all of these collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps and abstract, arcane financial instruments and derivatives that no one really understood, right? You've abstracted so much from the underlying asset that was ostensibly underpinning it. You've lost sight of the ground, right? And then you're hyper fragile and inflationary and going to collapse at some point.
Right, and shale came too late to save '08.
Mm.
Effectively, that's what a lot of people might argue. It's that we had a huge boom, but it was just 6 or 7 years too late to save our hyper leveraged system.
Obviously, like climate change and global warming and holes in the ozone layer and the melting of Arctic sea caps and rising of sea levels and all of the other problems, extreme weather events and so forth that come with climate change. That's kind of where the dominant conversation is, right? Like, not a lot of people are talking about the minerals and materials limitations of the planet. They're talking about the amount of carbon we're pumping into the atmosphere that has a lot of catastrophic consequences. So I'm wondering how that connects, because one viewer, could say, hey, you know, sure, we're running out of oil, we're running out of shale, but we're supposed to be phasing off of that stuff anyway, right? Because of climate change, and we're supposed to be reducing the amount of carbon output into the environment, into the atmosphere. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I agree that we shouldn't be as wasteful with oil, natural gas, and coal as we are. I mean, there's a hilarious alien perspective from Nate's book, which said that over the course of a few million years, if we were wiser, we would have kept a ton of oil, coal, and natural gas in the ground to use liberally during ice ages to reverse the climate cooling that happens on those long arcs. And it was hilarious because we don't think in these kinds of timescales. We're burning, hundreds of millions of years of stored fossil energy in 200 years. It's just insane what we're doing. And it's galactically rare that this could ever even happen, right?
Right, right. Well, I
So,
mean, right. I would tell the alien, I mean, that's a hell of a coordination problem in terms of the kind of game theoretic trap, right? The temptation for someone to be like, well, let's just burn all the low hanging energetic fruit, get a huge advantage when everyone else is trying to coordinate for some kind of sustainable future.
right, exactly. And I mean, the I think the argument is not uh, ignoring climate change. It's actually just putting something in front of it, which it's a difference of emphasis.
Mm,
And I think that's what throws a lot of people off. They think that um, speaking about energy and materials blindness kind of favors the fossil fuel industry and ignores climate change, but it's actually just trying to level the different emphasis on a topic that's actually going to hit us before the worst of climate change.
mm.
So, like, then there's a point in the book that was really interesting, and it said that while CO2 may be the trigger, methane might be the bullet, and that we have a ton of methane stored in the ice in the
Right.
Arctic that will melt, and it's in these strange like these like sheaths deep underwater that can melt as well. and that those might be actually mostly responsible for Earth's previous steam ages, where we had incredibly high heat and the ocean acidified and all of these things. It's obviously an enormous problem, but in addition to that starting to ramp up and decreasing ice in various places that melts and forms all of Earth's rivers, that's going to start declining. We're not ignoring climate change at all. We're just adding an additional variable, which is difficult in terms of complexity, because now we have a new energy and materials to handle, as well as a coming climate catastrophe. And we have to use fossil fuels very wisely to help transition to not only renewable tech for electricity, but figuring out how to actually use less in general, because we don't realize, I think most people who would call themselves environmentalists may not realize just how much we're still relying on fossil fuels for the lifestyles that we have. And we are not, there's been no conversion happen. So there's just been zero conversion. So it feels really nice. We're seeing wind farms and solar panels on houses in nice areas and Teslas and all these flowery articles coming out about what's technically possible in a lab. But fundamentally, I mean, 4% of global energy is renewable. 85% of our system is fossil fuel. So, I mean, we need to, I think, before thinking about full transitions, we need to be more worried about being wiser with what we have left and figuring out how to, especially things like planned obsolescence, right? Every solar panel and wind turbine we make should last as long as possible. And that's okay if it has to cost 50% more for each unit, but it lasts twice as long, maybe up to a century, and we can actually give wind turbines and solar panels to our grandchildren. That's the kind of conversation I would like to have, right? So I think that's where it needs to go. It needs to go into a very practical way to address the biggest sins we're still committing, planned obsolescence with like energy tech.
I didn't know that was happening in the energy field.
Well, there's a way. There are ways of making solar panels last longer, but it costs more. So of course, anything in our economic system is going to play by these dynamics. And maybe right now, no one feels, let's say your solar roof system costs $20,000 with all these subsidies or whatever. Maybe it costs 50 grand to have a system that lasts a century.
I see. Yeah.
Right. It's more than double the cost. Well, most people are going to be like, well, we're conditioned to think so short term. We're like, oh, no, I'll do it. All my neighbors will know I'm green. So that's enough. We'll call it 20K and we're done. Yes. But, we're leaving on the table a situation where that same amount of material could have lasted a century. And we really will wish we thought this way before it's too late.
Yeah, so two things I have to say to that. One is, if I was running for president, I would absolutely tackle this thing like as one of my biggest priorities. If there's something that can be done, whether it's subsidies or nationalizing certain industries so that you would take away the incentive for short-term buying patterns, right, on the part of consumers who are trying to optimize for the short term. I guess the other thing, though, is like one drawback of that would be that if we have solar panels that could last 100 years, and then we make a whole bunch of them, and then there was another innovation with solar panels that were even better, they would be like, okay, now we have a whole bunch of solar panels that are going to last a long time, but they're not as good anyway. So we might as well save it for the good stuff. But I mean, you can't really plan to do that, I guess, would be the difficult thing.
That's one of the most important parts that nobody talks about, right? We do have a huge rate of innovation with newer technology such as solar panels. And it may be that, like for instance, my parents, they don't have solar panels right now. Should they wait 20 years to get ones that are 3 or 4 times as efficient and maybe longer lasting? Or should they just buy them now? Because we know they may not feel like replacing them, which is kind of wasteful, in 10 or 20 years if they last 40. It's a really thorny problem. And that's why I think the idea of using as little as possible while we just spending most of our energy on innovation and smart consumption would give us the longest runway in that regard.
Very interesting and thought-provoking. All of this is one other thing I'll say too is thinking about methane. I mean, methane's already a problem with all of the like cow farts, right? And like all of the pastures and there's a whole cowspiracy kind of problem, right?
Compared to natural gas leakage, cow farting is a rounding error.
I wonder though what the real big methane bubbles that could be unleashed that are trapped in ice caps currently. Like I wonder if there's a kind of drawdown method, like comparing methane to carbon. Like, is there a way to sequester methane once it's released into the atmosphere?
Not okay. That's another. I'm glad you brought up capture, right? Because capture, right. I think the last two topics we should cover are capture and recycling.
Yeah, sure. I have 15 minutes.
Sure. Yeah. So let's do capture first. Carbon capture and methane capture. I think you could do both, but it is unbelievably energy inefficient to try and capture a highly dissipated gas that's gone up into the atmosphere. So we will not be able to meaningfully capture any of the carbon and methane we have released ever. Like the fate we have sealed through the amount of carbon we have put into the atmosphere is largely locked in. And it'll take, there were processes that were going to take tens of thousands of years that we've now hyper accelerated to the next couple of centuries. We're going to see a lot of action, most likely. But capture is not a realistic way of putting back any meaningful fraction of the carbon and methane we have and will release. Unfortunately, it's just not in the cards.
So reforestation is not a viable option in terms of
reforestation is fantastic, but we've taken so much algae. We've burned so much fossilized algae and other microorganisms that we should definitely reforest, and it will help us, and it will definitely increase oxygen production and make new green spaces and decrease pollution. But nothing we do on the time scale of our lives will bring all the carbon back into the ground that we have released.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
How
about recycling and the whole upcycling idea, the cradle to cradle idea?
It's a really good idea, but unfortunately there's a cost problem, right? Because we're always like 3 stages back in terms of what we can really recycle efficiently. So we recycle steel and aluminum really well, but that's that's like 1800s, 1900s materials. In terms of recycling batteries and the rare earths that are in microchips, we're not very good at recycling. So for instance, the current iPhone recycles about 20% of its material, but I don't know if that's by weight, and they won't say right on the Apple's reports, but if it's by weight, I mean, the aluminum case is, a ton of it. So the rare earths, the degree of micronization of all of these chips and most of the batteries and technology like that, it would be so energy inefficient to go in there and pry out the tiny amounts of materials that are in there that we basically just throw that in the furnace for now. And there will be no profitable way. Like a fully recycled iPhone made locally would probably cost $30,000.
Wow.
Right? I mean, we can't really recycle that stuff. Recycling can never profitably keep pace with what we manufacture. You also can't use what was, like, if we take an iPhone 7 or something and we recycle all the parts, we assume that all of the materials we have just recycled are up to spec to be utilized in the new generation of phone. But new technology often has different requirements for the source materials that the old stuff does not meet. And I don't know all of the complex reasoning behind that, but apparently it's not as simple as take old stuff and put it back into source material and utilize it with new stuff.
I see.
There's different complexity there that I've not found a good resource about unlocking knowledge on. So if anyone knows where I could access a resource like that, I would be open to it.
Yeah.
Nothing I know about that. I think we recycle 8.6% of our waste streams currently total.
Right.
Which is not nothing, but it's not even, we're nowhere near half of anything except for steel and aluminum and, big easy stuff, like stuff that you could put in a crusher. The idea of like, we're going to innovate our way out of the material problem, it's almost even harder than the energy problem. It's like, with the inability to scale upwards, to go from 0.5% of electric cars to 100%, to go through all the renewable energy, wind, solar, to get all the storage done, to still produce all of the consumer products that we need at the same time, and everything else that requires all of those minerals, and transport all of it using fossil fuels. We're going to have to make concessions somewhere in this landscape.
Absolutely. Yeah, it always comes back down to the mineral and material limitations that we forget that we have by virtue of living on a finite planet, right? I mean, even if we had the best innovations in energy technology, eventually we would, and even if those lasted, we had solar panels that were amazing, great EROI, lasted for 300 years, eventually down the road, we would run out of materials to make those things.
Yeah, and we would need to mine an asteroid, which requires minerals and energy and technology to get there. Yeah, you can't get away from it. It's fascinating. And I don't know all the answers about what we're going to do in the future, but I hope we have together framed some of the problems so that we can continue this investigation and figure out what some answers might be.
Exactly. And I think it also saves time going down rabbit holes to exploring answers that are just not going to work.
Yeah, we know what's not going to work. The miracle solutions of we can replace everything what we're doing right now with one energy source that you can even make a material out of, or a chemical. That's not, there's no easy fix going forward. We use a ton of energy, and we are probably going to see a future for ourselves where we use quite a bit less. And for most of us, because most of it is just wasted on nonsense, it won't even hurt most people in the first world very much, but it will be unfortunate for those in the developing world who haven't had the chance yet to get the essentials together.
Totally. Awesome. Well, Chris, thanks so much. This was super fun and very thought-provoking. And yeah, we'll do another episode sometime on another subject.
That sounds great, Ryan. Thanks so much for having me.
So say I'm in the middle of the road, not much to show, underachieving, average Joe, but I'm